Hello and welcome to this year's AQA pre-release video. This year's pre-release is all about the Morecambe Bay tidal barrage project. This video will be short, but it will just sort of talk you through some of the key themes that I've certainly picked up from having a little look at the pre-release booklet, and some sort of thoughts and suggestions really that you might want to consider as part of your revision. Now, the one thing I will say is I obviously can't use the pre-release booklet or any of the figures in this video due to copyright. So you might find it useful to hit pause now, grab your pre-release booklet so you can look at some of the things that I'm sort of talking about whilst I sort of go through them. Couple of big sort of key reminders really. Remember, you're getting an hour 30 minutes for this exam. That's worth noting if you're doing past papers. Some of the older past papers will say an hour 15. You now get an hour 30. There are 3 figures here, sort of split over 6 pages. So figure 1 is titled Energy in the UK. Figure 2 is towards a renewable energy future, so that's on pages 4 and 5. And then figure 3 is all about Morecambe Bay and the Duddon Estuary project, and you'll find that on pages 6 and 7 of the pre-release. You're sitting this exam then, 9 AM on the 12th of June, and the total for the paper is 76 marks. Remember, that's not the total for the pre-release, that's the total including your fieldwork and your unseen fieldwork. So questions 1, 2 and 3 will all be about the figures in the booklet that you hopefully by now have got in front of you. So figure 1 really, I think, does 3 jobs when I have a little look through it. The first thing it does is sort of talk to me a little bit about energy consumption in the UK. It talks to me about what role it's playing, so that sort of peachy yellow box at the top mentions about its role in our daily lives. And I think they could possibly ask you a 1-mark question here, sort of saying, outline the role that energy plays in your daily life. The next thing it talks to me about is a bit about energy security. So that's making sure you've got an uninterrupted but affordable supply, and you've got some data around that. We'll talk about that in a second. And then there's quite a few graphs in here that give me sort of comparisons then between the UK and Europe, and chats a little bit then about this sort of affordable energy supply in a little bit more detail. So here, if I'm sort of delving a little bit more, okay, into this available energy supply, okay, and thinking a bit more about energy security, I'm just thinking about the amount of available energy and how this impacts then quality of life, okay? If I'm thinking about possible impacts on quality of life from the total amount of energy I've got available, I'm thinking a little bit about, well, how does it impact on food and water? So I might say, well, if I haven't got enough energy, I'm unable to grow enough food, I'm unable to be able to treat enough water to be able to support the needs of the population. I might talk a little bit about how it impacts on heating, so again, on my quality of life. I might talk about its impact on communications and how that could be interrupted. If I think about the pandemic here, it's always a really good example of how available energy there impacted on our quality of life. Okay, consumption levels, you could argue, went up because everyone was at home. Again, draw here on some of your previous experience. So sticking with this energy consumption, you'll notice I've got a similar graph to the one that's in the pre-release. I go by the data obviously that you've got in the pre-release in front of you. We can see that energy consumption then between sort of 1990 and 2021 has generally declined. So if they ask me in the exam to analyse the data, they'll probably call it figure 1, analyse the data here. The first thing I'd say to get a mark is to say, well, energy consumption has generally declined, okay? I then want to quote a piece of data or quote a specific fact then from the graph in front of me to get my second mark. So I might say, right, well, the most significant decrease I can see in this figure happens in industry. If I look at the trend over time, particularly the one that you've got in the figure, I can see there's quite a big drop about 2020. Seems fairly consistent with the others, but again, scanning along, having a little look along the graph here, this is the one that seems to be fairly consistent before the drop. So that might be the one here that I choose to pick out and I choose to sort of examine in a little bit more detail. The text next to the graph in the figure does sort of provide some useful commentary to the graph. So it starts to sort of say, well, this potentially is some of the reasons why. So it does talk about the lockdown, it does talk about COVID a little bit, and sort of hints that maybe this is some of the reason behind that trend or behind that decline then in 2020. Again, you could talk a little bit here about how it's influenced consumption. So you could say, well, businesses have closed, therefore you've got fewer people using energy, and that could be behind potentially that trend in industry. So if it's a describe the data or analyse the data, point that it's declined, my example here, perhaps most significant decline in industry. If it's explain a little bit or suggest one reason behind the decline, I would talk about the pandemic and say, well, businesses closed, therefore they were consuming less energy. That for me sort of feels like the logical way to go. Okay, moving swiftly on then. Underneath, it now talks to you about the UK's energy mix versus the UK's electricity mix. Okay, what this point here, I suppose it's trying to make by these two pie charts as well, we are still reliant to some degree then on fossil fuels. If I look at the trends between the two, they could ask you to compare the two sets of data. If I'm comparing the two here, let's talk about where your two biggest percentages are, where your two smallest are. So you could say, well, couldn't you, for example, in the UK's total energy mix, oil is the biggest, it makes up 40%. However, in terms of electricity mix, oil is one of the smallest contributors at only 4%. That would get me 2 marks. Interesting here as well that they've just sort of basically bullet pointed the data and given it to you almost as like facts that they're looking for you to do something with. So I think a possible question here, because they like to get those AO4 marks into this section, they could ask you to complete some graphs with this on. So I've just sort of mocked it up on 2 pie charts. They could ask you to go back and fill in sections of a graph and just take the data from the figure and then complete the graph, and then they could ask you to analyse the data. So I suppose be prepared here to draw some graphs is sort of the long and short of this message. Calculator, ruler, pencil, etc. All the gear you'd expect for graphs. So energy security then is something I said we'd come back to. If I'm defining energy security, I'm saying, well, this is my reliable, affordable, sustainable access to energy without significant disruption. So you could argue that one example of significant disruption was the pandemic, and that influenced people's ability to be able to have that affordable or reliable supply. Okay, you could choose to critique a variety of other factors. I quite like that underneath it here it talks to you about economic political stability. So they're almost hinting at a couple more factors here that could influence energy security. So I think maybe for 4 marks they could ask you here to sort of describe maybe 2 reasons or 2 things that could impact on energy security. They could ask you to suggest a reason, to outline one maybe for 3 marks here. And in which case they've sort of hinted at the answers, haven't they, in that sort of beigey bluey box, but they haven't really told you much around them. So that's sort of one good way of them testing your sort of geographical knowledge there. The other thing that I was just sort of chatting about were those 4 A's of energy security. You've got these in the booklet in front of you, but they're only sort of giving you them in one word. So I've just sort of thought a little bit around what these could mean, okay? So in terms of your 4 A's of energy security, you've got availability. So is there the resource in front of you now? So if I take oil, for example, have you got oil in the ground that you can get? I think the next big one is accessibility. So how easy is it to get? Can you get that oil out of the ground and can you transport it? Then you've got acceptability. So how environmentally friendly, how socially friendly is it? Are people going to be happy with me taking that oil from the ground? And then you've got your affordability. So that's cost for the business, so cost for people getting it out of the ground, plus that's cost for consumers. Okay, so people using that oil or using that energy. So underneath this, it then talks about factors that are affecting that energy security. Well, hang on a minute. That's come up twice now and is almost covering 1/3 of that page. So I think they're almost hinting here this is going to be a good 4 or 6 marker. So it starts to talk to me a bit more about those factors that I said above, they've just bullet pointed. So it talks about the physical environment, it tells about costs, it tells about technology, political factors here. So I think they could be asking you here, couldn't they, to describe or discuss factors influencing energy security. So if it was me, I might say, oh wow, the most significant factor influencing energy security is political factors, because this impacts trade. If there's sort of uncertainty in the world, or if there's war, this might impact on a country's ability to be able to extract or to trade resources, therefore threatens energy security. I could talk about costs and say, well, perhaps another more significant factor is cost. That's cost to the consumer, because if you can't afford it, then you can't afford to maintain your reliable supply. That's cost as well for those that are extracting it, so businesses. And again, they've got to be able to balance that cost and make it viable in order then to achieve energy security first. So all I would do if that question popped up was I'd take a couple of the bullet points, 2, I wouldn't go any more than 3 really, from that bottom box, and I would just explain them. So how could that lead to there being an unaffordable supply, or how could that lead to someone not being able to have energy, I suppose in simple form, is what the question will be asking you to do there. Okay, let's have a little look then. If I turn to sort of page 3 in the pre-release, I'm now sort of having a little think through these graphs. Remember I said I can't put them in the video, but we can certainly talk about them. So the first graph that comes up is this one here that talks about the balance between imports and exports of energy between 1970 and 2020. Well, that's interesting. They've stopped the data in 2020. So again, they could ask you in the exam then to plot the next few years. Interesting that it stops at 2020, which is when, if I look back at my first graph, that sort of peak of decline happened for pretty much each one of those sectors. So again here, we could start to just think a little bit around the analysis of the graph. So it wouldn't be past them, I don't think, here to ask you to describe the data, in which case just say what you see. So what's the overall trend? Well, it goes up and goes down, but you're going to be a bit more specific than that, aren't you? You'll say, well, there's a big decline about 1980, then it starts to rise again about 1990. You might say, well, energy exports, again, are back up again about 2000, before we're importing more again, come sort of 2012, okay? That seems to sort of link up with the graph that you've got underneath it, about electricity demand and electricity capacity. Notice the two different lines there. So capacity is how much you could have, demand is how much people need at the moment. So at the moment you could say, well, we've got a good balance between the two, if they ask you to describe it. Well, where is capacity the highest? Well, capacity seems to have been the highest in 2011. Demand seems to have been the highest back in about 2008, 2009. So again, just compare the two lines you can see on the graph. Again, like the data stops at 2022, so you could well be asked to go back and fill that in. Okay, where's the UK fit in then to this bigger picture? So this is this lovely little map or graph that you've got at the bottom here of page 3. Some countries on that notice haven't been shaded in. They're saying it's no data. They could ask you then, couldn't they, to complete the key in the exam. I think here they could ask you to do a little bit of data manipulation. So one of the things I'm certainly thinking about here is then possibly asking you how many countries have a greater share than the UK, how many countries have a lesser share than the UK. Potentially here, I think maybe getting you just to think a little bit beyond the data that you've been given. So they could ask you to present this in a different format. So notice here I presented it as a bar graph. They could go back, couldn't they, and say, well, suggest one of the reasons maybe why you've got the UK, Germany, etc. having this greater share of solar energy. Why are we maybe using more than other countries? Possible question, I think. Okay, moving on to figure 2 then. So this all starts on page 4 of your pre-release. Figure 2 sort of covers 3 key areas. So it talks to me first and foremost about what renewable energy is and different renewable sources. It talks about positives and negatives of renewables. And then they start towards the end of page 5 just to introduce me to a tidal power project. Okay, I think actually figure 2 here, by the time these questions come up, are really, really nice. So renewable energy then, if we start with just the definition. If I'm thinking about renewable energy, I'm saying, right, this is energy that's generated from natural sources and replenishes over time. So be that solar, wind, wave, etc. Okay, I'm now going to start just to think, right, what are my types here? What can I do with it? What are the advantages? What are my disadvantages? So my renewable energy sources in the UK, they give to me on 2 graphs. Okay, they first of all show me this lovely little pie chart to show me the makeup of how much renewable energy I've got. Isn't that snazzy? That's lovely. So they talk to you here and say, well, bioenergy makes up 61% of the total renewable energy used in the UK. Then you've got wind, you've got solar and geothermal. So they could ask you to suggest a reason why there's such a difference there. I would always say cost is the easy answer to give in the exam. Well, it costs more, doesn't it, to set up a solar or geothermal station versus it does potentially to use wind energy or bioenergy. Underneath them, it shows you a little bit more about what these are. So bioenergy is the one that we use the most. You could argue that's the easiest one, isn't it, to use your plant animal matter, so you're composting, etc., or generating heat from it to therefore use as power. And then underneath, they give you all of these advantages and disadvantages. I've taken that whole paragraph of text and just tried to bullet point it into these sort of more convenient points for your revision. But again, 6 marks could quite possibly come here, I think, given how much information they've given you on renewable energy and its advantages and disadvantages. So I think they're highly likely here to ask you to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of renewable energy. I think they might ask you here to evaluate the use of renewable energy in the UK, and in which case you're going to tell me about the positives and negatives and quite possibly give some examples here, because they've given you some sort of facts and some info about each one of the sources above. So if it was me approaching this question, I might talk about sustainability, I might talk about the fact that making some of these creates jobs, I might talk about the fact the disadvantages here, that it does take up a lot of space, it's highly expensive, initial setup costs here are often high, so it does take a long while here for you to get your initial investment or your cash back. Okay, then they launch into, I'm now on page 5 of the pre-release, telling us a little bit about Morecambe Bay and the Duddon Estuary. Okay, so they sort of introduce this plan and say, right, we want to make this suggestion that we're going to be able to provide this clean energy. I think it's the next 100 years, they say. It's going to help them to look after 2 million homes, creating 13,000 jobs. They're sort of on the sell here. They're taunting us to love this project as much as they do. This tidal gateway project essentially is going to connect 2 areas together. I think it's just outside Heysham and going to go across the bay. And they're going to, part of this, then put in this barrage. They're going to be able to use it also as a road. Isn't this amazing? Look, we're not just getting all this energy from it. We're now going to connect 2 towns. Isn't this fantastic for your tourism? Is sort of how they're trying to sell this project to you. However, as you sort of read on towards the end of that yellow box and into the blue one beneath it, they talk to you about the environmental importance of the area. Okay, they say, well, the RSPB absolutely love this area. Again, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds then have got a nature reserve here. They look after the wildlife. I've got a nice little area here that's got this huge environmental importance to it because it's got these tidal mudflats, this beautiful salt marsh. So lots of people are coming here and have done for many generations as part of this sort of historic scenic site and to enjoy it as part of the tourism industry. So they've got huge concerns about building this tidal barrage across it because they feel it's going to impact on some of the wildlife there, which is one of the main reasons behind some of the tourism. So in figure 3, which is pages 6 and 7 of your pre-release booklet, what they start to do then is sort of talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this project. They tell us about the projected aims of it, and then I think they're going to sort of build you towards this 9-mark question of, well, should the project go ahead? And they'll ask you to tick a box, yes or no, and then you'll be asked to explain your reasons why then for 9 marks. So I think if I take all of the information from figure 3, so that's pages 6 and 7 of your pre-release, I can sort of bullet point it down into the following sort of yes and no table for this project. I think, well, yes, it's going to give us 100 years worth of clean energy. Isn't that fantastic? Supporting 2 million homes, it's creating 13,000 jobs, £20 billion boost to the local economy. We're going to have some flood protection in there, and tidal power is fairly reliable. So on the sell point of that, I could categorise these as well. So if they ask me to what extent do I think the project is sustainable, the same plan I've got on the screen here would also work, because then I could categorise these into social, economic and environmental and say, yep, this is why it's sustainable, this is why it's not sustainable. So I think, not to sell this, but I think this is sort of my bulletproof plan for the 9 marker. On the no side of this, okay, if it's sustainable or should it go ahead, you've got to talk, I think, about that £10 billion cost. That's a lot of money. Where's this money coming from? It's 10 times more expensive than wind. So it sort of begs the obvious question, well, why are you not investing in wind? Why are you investing in tidal energy that's going to cost you 10 times more, affect the local fishing, interfere with a triple SI site and get loads of people really angry? Sort of, why would you do that? Okay, it's going to take you 25 years to complete this. But on the flip side of that, you'd say, well, 25 years to complete it, but 100 years worth of clean renewable energy, surely this has got to be the case, okay? Remember, if it's a 9-mark question like this, you've got to give your own opinion, you've got to evaluate, and you've got to show the examiner you've drawn on all 3 figures. So you've got to say, well, in figure 1, it shows me there's a clear need for this energy because our demand's gone up, we need more energy in order to have energy security. In figure 2, it tells me the advantage of tidal energy. It's providing me clean energy, it's sustainable, it's never going to run out. And now in figure 3, it's giving me 100 years of renewable energy and telling me about all these fantastic jobs it's going to create. Isn't this amazing? Then you do exactly the same in your counter argument. Well, my counter argument is no, it shouldn't go ahead, because figure 1 shows me it's actually a decline in our consumption. Figure 2 tells me, well, it's great, but it can be really expensive to set up. And figure 3 tells me, yeah, it's going to take 25 years to build and is 10 times more expensive than wind. No, the project shouldn't go ahead. Right, now let me reach my conclusion. Okay? There's no harm in you signposting figures 1, 2 and 3 throughout your 9-mark answer. In fact, I'd encourage you to do it because that's what the examiner's looking for. You could also weigh up, if it's more about sustainability, you could bring in this energy trilemma that they give to you on page 7, I think it is off the top of my head. Yes, it is. And I could say, right, in order for it to be sustainable, I've got to ask myself, is it affordable? Is it good for people, money, the environment? And does it afford me security? And if I can answer all 3 of those questions, then yes, it's sustainable. So if it's a 9-mark sustainability type question, you could do 1 paragraph for and give an example of how it meets these 3 things. And then 1 paragraph against and give an example about how it doesn't meet these 3 things. Stakeholders are always really useful to bring in here. So stakeholder is anybody that has a view on something. So for example, you're all stakeholders with a view on school uniform or mobile phones in schools. These guys have all got a view about whether this tidal barrage project should go ahead. So you could talk about the NTPG. They're sort of listed throughout your pre-release booklet. Okay, they want this to go ahead because they want the huge economic benefits. They want that 400 million a year, okay, worth of investment from economic growth. Your energy consultants, the RSPB, don't. Okay, they want something that's a little bit more reliable, a little bit more cheaper and less of an impact on the environment. Your conservation manager sort of sitting on the fence here. So if you're struggling in the exam, this is one you could make go both ways. You could say, well, yeah, they're not too fussed about it. They know they can create habitats elsewhere. However, they're saying no because of migrating wildlife. So they're giving you that sort of for and against balance. So back at that 9-marker plan I was talking about, with figure 1 says this, 2 says this, 3 gives me my best evidence for this. As part of that figure 3, bring in those stakeholders. So figure 3 says, yes, actually, it's going to cost me 10 times more than if I was to invest in wind energy. That's also supported by the view of the energy consultant who wants to focus on energy from wind because it's more reliable. Then you're showing again that you have used information from the source then that's in front of you. So I'll leave it here. I'll pause it here. I think there's 2 ways they could sort of phrase the 9 markers. I've written them up as I think they're going to appear in the exam. Remember, at the end of the section, question 3, you're only going to get 1 of these. But as I said, that plan I had a few sort of screens ago is like my best plan that I would use if I was going to tackle one of these 9 markers. And I really hope this helps. The very best of luck in your exam.